Good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting me, and particularly, of course, the Institute. Coming back to Peter Hoenig's comment, I think the organization thought, well, we have to have at least 2 Flying Dutchmen in the beginning. So Peter and I have both genes somewhere near the canal, so we're very privileged to be here. I would like to talk a little bit more also about not only the systems and the procedures, because we will hear a lot about ICH and WHO and what the different regulatory hemispheres have added to it and are doing. I will look in a number of cases from my perspective as a regulator where I see sources of variance for different regulatory decision making. And that is something that really is interesting because I feel also being both as a regulator but also still closely related to academic work, we try to understand why people make decisions within the same hemisphere with respect to the law, using the same data, and how they have different perspectives on the same data and the same science. Well, you have heard this. I would like to start here. I was in the summer in 2012. I was at the flea market in Lisbon. And there is a huge marketplace there out about cell phone adapters. And if you have grown-up kids like I have at home, your average number of adapters is about 9. Because every cell phone you buy, there is something new or something different. And actually, these guys make a whole business out of that. And I think the non-harmonized world of cell phone adapters is something is interesting, I think, for a flea market and to have problems at home, because usually when you try to find the adapter you want to have, it's never there. You always have to find somewhere else. But that is something we don't think that it's good for patients and public health. So we want to get beyond this. And I know that the cell phone industry is also working on that a lot, but they have also their own problems, and as we have. I think the important listing of reasons, and Peter Hoenig has already addressed that, the equal access to patients and work sharing, being efficient, avoid redundant use of both animal and also clinical trial data. But if I would like to share with you this morning what is at the top of my priority in terms of regulatory perspective, I think the first and the last one. The first is very much on, at the moment, there are differences in regulatory decision-making or systems. Well, then patients don't have equal access, and then I bridge to the last point. That always leads to the discussion and or to the question from the public, from the politicians, from the news media, etc. Why are you accepting this product? Why and FDA is not doing it, vice versa, and how to explain that? And more, we are in that situation of dealing with that. And of course, all the other reasons are important, and we will have more discussions about that over the next 2 days. But I think as a kickoff, from my perspective, is particular ensure equal access to patients, but also how can we promote but also restore trust in medicines, given all the variances we've seen all over the world? Because patients, and while I'm speaking here, we have quite a crisis in the Netherlands on a specific drug product, where people come with websites that say, well, these authorities have not accepted this product, and you have a different position here. Please explain. It brings me also to the point that the stakes are high. And just in the airplane, I read this on the Novo Nordisk shares that fell 40% just in the afternoon early this week, where the FDA requests additional cardiovascular outcome data on Tresiba, and one of the new long-acting insulins, and the authorities in the EU, so the CHMP, has taken a positive decision on that in October, and the Japanese authorities, the PMDA, was there on September, I understand. And there is a CEO says, well, the FDA is more risk-averse than its counterpart EU, which looks more at the benefits. Well, I disagree with the statement because I know tons of examples, and you know them also, where it's the opposite, where it's the other way around. So that's not that I'm putting this on the screen, but I'm putting this on the screen. This is there, and next week there is another situation as well. And we have to deal with that, and we have to find out why. It's also important that when we look at regulatory systems that we try to understand where we're coming from. Of course, basically we started there to ensure patient safety, to safeguard patient safety from the beginning. And we know all the examples from the past. And we have a clear vision, to promote and to ensure also public health. But more and more we see also, and this conference I think is very appropriate also to address that, it is not only that we are the gatekeepers, but we try to find also ways to promote innovation, of course, when the data allow us to do so. And we had a little commentary in Science about that, where we also are saying that looking at increasing demand from regulatory authorities is important to address, particularly in the search of regulatory science, and putting this on the table is, I think, also a very important point when we look at variance and of harmonization. But within the whole framework and I have to admit, my focus in this talk is very much on the clinical, on the safety part, so less on the quality part of the dossier. When I look at the key questions, and when my children ask me, what are you doing so as a regulator? So, well, there are 4 questions important. Well, what about the diagnosis and the definition of disease? What about the endpoints already addressed by Peter Hoenig? How to identify the target population that may benefit, and finally, what kind of comparisons is useful, needed, and feasible. And if you look over the today's challenges, you see a lot of differences where some psychiatric morbidities are well accepted in one country and not in another country. Where we have ongoing discussions when we look at endpoints about the progression-free survival and the overall survival in oncology. I will come back to that later on. I already mentioned the Trasiba case in the newspaper, where the discussion is about, well, are we accepting a biomarker, or do we want to have cardiovascular outcomes data, as it is now in the case of Trasiba? Biomarkers is the same, where we have ongoing discussions about the science, but also about the implementation to identify. And when I look at the CHMP, very often we have also the discussion not only about the science itself, but also, okay, this biomarker will be implemented very good, for instance, in London or in Paris, but what about other countries? Do they have the same level of implementation possibilities as other countries have? So it's not only the science, but also the implementation that may drive different decisions at the end of the day. And of course, finally, where there is, I think, a big difference all over the world, where we know that FDA is very much on placebos, where I see there is a change, but where the Europeans is very much on active control comparison, with all the discussions about assay sensitivity and so on. So even within all the frame we have, the procedure, etc., these basic questions about the science in the dossier, the data, and also the evaluated data, it's very important. And they also, are at the table when we look at variants of decision-making by different authorities. But it's also important what's in the head of people who look at dossiers. And I just want to give you some insight on a meeting we had last week, where I met all my clinical assessors. It's about 100 people, and we had in a room like this, and we were very critical on a number of dossiers we evaluated over the last couple of years. And I looked at a number of dossiers. Actually, I have to say, even as a chairman, so even as the last responsible, I was not happy with. And I want to share with them, I noticed 5 archetypes of problematic dossier crunching. I noticed that there were dossiers where my people say, well, we don't like this product at all. And I tried to challenge them. And why? What is the science? What is the reasoning, the logic behind that? I saw also dossiers where the assessors, for a lot of good reasons, just lost in the details. And here I think there is a very important link also between the quality of how the industry delivers the dossier. I see a close correlation when we have a poor dossier on the table. I get a poor assessment. I get a poor review very often. Then the third one is we struggle. It's a new innovative concept, etc. And asking for money to make us feel good. And at the end of the day, will it become a better product, or does it only feel as good? And then we see very often also, particularly in the advanced therapies and in the gene therapies and other areas where we are reluctant to cross borders, where we see risk avoidance. And then I see also dossiers where the reviewers say, wow, this is heaven, this is beautiful, this is so positive. And I try to understand why. Do the data support this positivism? Well, of course, there are more archetypes, but the reason I put this here on the screen is there's a lot of things are happening in in the committees, in the reviewers, in the assessment committees, that also drives variance in different decision making. And that is albeit ICH, WHO, and all the initiative, and I think we also, in my view, should acknowledge that and also work on that. And of course, we have the whole issue about, well, are we regulating according to a principle-based or rule-based regulation? And I take this metaphor where American football is compared to European soccer. Personally, I'm very much in favor of a more principle-based way of regulation, although I know that a lot of people, even in my own teams, but also industry, is struggled a lot with that because you always lose predictability when you go for a more principle-based way of regulation. But this is also, at the table when I look at different hemispheres of how products are regulated, and I'm sure we come back also later on today and tomorrow. But it's also important when you look at the data, what at the end of the day really drives whether, for instance, in this case, the CHMP becomes positive or negative. And what you see here is a paper published in Nature Drug Discovery as part of the so-called ESHA project, where EMA colleagues and our group looked at reasons of non-approval and approval, and where we looked at, in total, 68 products, 23 were non-approved, and 45 were approved. And these are the data of the identification of problems, real problems, so major objections, halfway of the procedure. And when you look at the learning phase and the confirmatory phase, so the confirmatory phase, typically the large phase 3 trials and so on, where it's plus and plus, while you see almost 89% will be approved. But it's also very important when you look at the bottom of this slide, where you see, well, even minus still, at the end of the day, 9 products were approved, given that at halfway there was quite some major objections, etc. And this becomes very close where I started my presentation, where a lot of discussions try to weigh very often also clinical benefit and also patient demands and patient needs are very important to bring at the end of the day a decision in a certain direction. And it is given all the same data, because the data didn't change over time. Of course, there was some new analysis, etc. But at the end of the day, the data were used to come to this decision. And that brings me also to the point that how different regulators are looking at certain individual products. And we, the Dutch team is responsible for dronedarone, a compound product against atrial fibrillation, Multac, and where we, from the beginning, had a lot of discussions about the benefit risk, also given the comparative data that was also shown in the project, in the dossier. This was also highlighted in the New England Journal of Medicine at the end of 2011, and where we responded to that, where, for instance, we were already working on adjustment of the label, particularly also to have a more stricter formulation of the contraindication, particularly patients who were more susceptible for cardiovascular events than others. So here I think the science, but also the way of clinical thinking, the adjustment of the SPC, were very much in a line. There were different patterns at the end of the day, but if you now look at how the labels are, in the same way, I think that is progress, and there's a lot of convergence here to see. It's also important when you look at, particularly oncology, where this, of course, booming. If you look now at the pipelines of most of the companies, it's oncology. And very often it's still oncology, and that worries me a lot because there are a lot of other unmet medical needs as well. In our team, we looked, and in this paper, published in 2011, and at the last 100 indications, both approved by FDA and EMA, where we identified at least 47 where there was a real difference in the wording between the indications. But only in 10 of these, there was a real clinical, meaningful difference between the two. And I'm very keen to mention that here, that when you look at differences, very often you say, well, oh, there is a difference. But when you really go into the clinical meaning, what does it really mean for clinical practice and the patient, it was not as big as it was seen in the beginning. So looking at variance of the regulatory decision making also means we have to look in not only the superficial data, but also look into the details, what's really meaningful, what's really affecting patient care and also clinical practice. And that brings me to another point I would like to share with you, and that is how we at different hemispheres, and this is the Avastin case where the FDA at the end of the day, and that is of course known in this audience, took a different position than the European did, but how to communicate that. And I was so impressed by how the FDA report, the public report on all the reasoning behind the way the label the label of treating metastatic breast cancer at the end of the day was withdrawn. I gave that piece to every student, to every assessor in our team, because everything was balanced in my view, and all the pieces were together, all the perspectives were taken to board, but at the end of the day, well, there was a logical reasoning to that decision. I don't necessarily agree with the decision, but the way it was communicated and the way it was written down, I think that is a landmark paper in my view to address, and I was very happy also to share that with other colleagues. So apart from the variance itself, we strongly believe also that the communication around that is a key part we should also discuss during these 2 days. Because public and politicians and physicians asked for that, and we don't say, well, we have different systems, so we came to a different decision. I think that is not acceptable anymore, and we should work on progress here. There is another area where, of course, and we have one session on that, on safety regulations, and our team looked at safety regulations and biologicals, and maybe you have seen that paper in JAMA a couple of years ago, where essentially both FDA and EMA flagged the same issues with the same biologicals. But there was a difference in timing. There was a difference in regulatory steps in different, etc. And this is, of course, related to the system. You know, the FDA has the black box system, while the Europeans don't have. They have a more different system. There is now new legislation in Europe on the pharmacovigilance, and I expect that may also change the picture, etc. But overall, these data show that the superficial picture was, wow, there is a difference. But looking at the real data, etc., what was really clinical meaningful for the patient was not as big as we would expect. The only part was here timing. And I think that timing is, of course, very important, because when we are under an open window where, of course, everybody follows what we are deciding. And at the end of the day, I think it's important also that we can explain when there is a difference in timing between the different regulatory hemispheres. A lot of variance, in my view, on regulatory decision-making comes back to outcomes and making comparison. It's already alluded on that in the beginning, where on the vertical axis in this graph we see biomarkers, clinical outcomes, HTA, or more societal effects, and where we have on the horizontal axis placebo, standard treatment, and alternative scenario. When we look at the diabetic drugs, well, once we all know that it was most of the products were compared to placebo, and it was approved on the basis of a biomarker, HbA1c or something else. And now more and more, I think the shift is from the left bottom to the right top, and we will discuss that over the next couple of days. Coming back to the Tresiba example, there FDA asked for more clinical outcomes, some outcomes data, to be assured about the possible adverse effect on the cardiovascular system. And I think that concern is also shared by European regulators, although the mechanism to handle with that is different. I think here I come back to what Peter Hoenig already addressed, and then, that the left bottom is what we can achieve in a very pragmatic and a very efficient way, I guess. But there's a strong trend to go from the left bottom to the right top, to ask more comparisons, and to have more different outcomes. And of course, the question of harmonization is very important, because no society can afford to go to the right top. There is no way out here. So there is a certain moment you can say, well, here enough is enough, and also acceptable by many regulators and also societies, etc. So I hope that this also will be part of the discussion we have over the next couple of days. I would like to close off. As I said before, I'm heavily involved in a project called the ASHA project, where regulators and patient groups and industry and academia meet once in a while, where we try to rethink the regulatory system, and part of the data you have seen today are also part of that system, of that project. But when I look at one of the menu charts of one of the recent meetings we had, where we discussed biomarkers, where we discussed regulators looking at therapeutic value, role of patient groups, pharmacoeconomic burdens, conditional approval, and so on. A lot of this is, of course, in regulatory system, but a lot of this is also in the way how people look at the data, how they approach different ways of looking at benefit, harm of different products, but also how they, at the end of the day, try to fill the gap between the unmet medical need out there and what we as regulators, as developers, can contribute to that. And having said that, I'm happy to close, and I hope that this perspective can also contribute to the discussions we have over the next couple of days. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. I think both the talks from Peter and Hubert were a great way to set us off. Very constructive, very objective, and I'd like to ask some questions now, but we haven't put that in the agenda. We'll have an opportunity to involve them in the discussion as we go forward over today and tomorrow. The first session that we have is the principles and definitional considerations. When we had our very early planning sessions, Tom mentioned to me the use of the term regulatory convergence instead of harmonization, and I really didn't fully understand what he was talking about, but after many planning sessions and also after attending a Asian regulators meeting a few weeks ago, I now fully understand what convergence means as opposed to harmonization, and it's just to underline that the language that we use around harmonization is very, very important. We just heard about a regulator's view of communication, and I agree with that as well. How we communicate about decisions that regulators make is extremely important, and how we talk about the comparison between those decisions and rules is also very important. So that's the focus of the next session, and I'm really happy to introduce our first speaker, Andrea Sider, who's a senior health specialist for pharmaceuticals, health, nutrition, and population at the World Bank. Thank you.